My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report, and joining me for the hour is Mr. Bill Browder, who's got a hell of a background, best-selling author, and has a lot to say when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Bill, for those who are not familiar with your background, give us a 30,000-foot view of who you are, how'd you get involved in markets, investing in Russia, and what's happened since 2005.
So I am the grandson of the head of the American Communist Party. He was my grandfather was there between 1932 and 45. And when I was going through I was born in '64. When I was going through my teenage rebellion, I decided to become a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated business school in '89, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And I said to myself, if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has come down, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe, and that's what I set out to do. And I first moved to London, and then I moved to Moscow in 1996. I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, and it grew to become the largest investment fund in the country with about $4.5 billion of assets under management. Then I discovered something really maybe not surprising, but pretty shocking, which is that every last dollar of profit was being stolen out of every one of my portfolio companies by these corrupt oligarchs and government officials. And so I decided to start to challenge that. The way I did that was to research how they did the stealing and then expose it through the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. And for a while, it had a very positive effect because it was just at the same time that Putin was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. The oligarchs were stealing power from him as they were stealing money from me. And so he was sort of strangely on my side for the first couple of years of this process. But then he decided to win his war with the oligarchs by arresting the richest guy in the country, a guy named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the owner of an oil company called Yukos. He arrests him, he puts him on trial, and he allows the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage on trial. And the other oligarchs came to him and said, "What do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage?" And Putin said 50%. And that was the moment he became the richest man in the world. And that was the moment that my fortunes turned very badly in Russia. I was expelled from the country. My offices were raided. I had a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky who was working for me, and he started to investigate why they were going after us. And he discovered that it was all part of a very ingenious and corrupt scheme where a bunch of corrupt officials stole $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government. He exposed the theft, testified against the officials involved, and then he was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed on November 16th, 2009, at the age of 37, a little more than 13 years ago. And since then, I've put aside my work as a fund manager, and I've been spent the last 13 years devoting all of my time, energy, and resources to go after the people who killed Sergei, and I've become a full-time justice activist, and that's led to something called the Magnitsky Act, which was passed in the United States in 2012, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of human rights violators in Russia. And Putin really didn't like that at all, and has tried to stop me from doing it elsewhere, tried to repeal the Magnitsky Act in the United States, even sent one of his own guys to, was actually a woman, he sent a woman to Trump Tower right after Trump was nominated before he was elected. And he, anyways, he didn't succeed in repealing the Magnitsky Act, and instead instead we have 36 Magnitsky Acts around the world, and it's all going really badly for him. The Magnitsky Act is now the piece of the template which is being used to sanction the Russian oligarchs and Russian government officials responsible for the war in Ukraine. And we really found his Achilles heel, which is his money.
Take us back for a moment to when you were investing in Russia, because you said that they were basically stealing from you. It became clear over time. I'm just curious, was it blatantly obvious? Was it obfuscated, and you had to do a little bit of due diligence to see that there was corruption? What was happening in terms of your conclusion there?
Well, so let me give you an example. So the biggest company in Russia is a company called Gazprom. I'm sure everyone's heard of Gazprom on this call. Gazprom is I think 10 times larger than Exxon per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves. Um, Gazprom was trading at a 99.7% discount to Exxon per barrel hydrocarbon reserves. And the reason everyone thought it was trading so cheaply was because everything was being stolen. And the reason everyone thought everything was stolen was that if you looked at the income statement of Gazprom, it was a non-profit company. They didn't make any money, and uh, and so, I mean, so it was sort of obvious on the surface there was something wrong. The problem was, how do you get below the surface to actually figure out who was doing it and what they were doing? And this is where something sort of interesting comes in, which is that you think that Russia is really a sort of opaque place. People can't imagine that it's very transparent. But in fact, it's actually one of the most transparent places in the world for a really strange reason, which is that Russia's the most bureaucratic country in the world. There's basically every single thing that ever happens in Russia gets written down by someone and then monitored and entered into a database by some ministry. And no matter how private the information is, these guys working in the ministries are so badly paid that they basically, to survive, they put all the information up for sale. And so if you and I were in Russia and I was trying to do a little due diligence on you before our meeting, I could get your bank statements, I could get your medical records, I could get your travel records, I could figure out who you're calling on your mobile phone, and I could do that for like a tiny amount of money. And so as a result of this crazy lack of data protection, we were able to really dig deep into what was going on in Gazprom and Sberbank and some of the other big companies out there. And we were able to figure out exactly who was doing the stealing, how they were doing the stealing, where the money was going to, how much was going, and it was really pretty unbelievable. And the journalists in Moscow loved me because I was saving each of them like months worth of investigative work because we were doing it for our own purposes. But all they had to do was verify it afterwards, and so we were able to really name and shame and expose a lot of these people.
If it's I hate to say if it's that easy, but if it's in quotes that easy, why hasn't there been maybe more of a focus around investor protections? We'll talk about the human rights aspect, but yeah, there are a lot of very smart people that invested in Russia prior to Russia going into Ukraine, and presumably the dynamics haven't really changed since then.
Well, I mean, I've ever since I was expelled from the country and Sergei Magnitsky was murdered, I've been going around the world trying to convince people that it's a totally lawless place. And uh, and I would say most people listen to me. I mean, there's not that many people that were investing in Russia. I mean, and it's always this sort of kind of you know people get attracted by the valuations and they want to and they can't really understand that there's a reason. Sometimes things are cheap and they're cheap for a reason. And in the case of Russia, it was cheap for a very good reason, which is that there's no property rights, there's no rule of law. If someone screws you, which they do all the time, you have no recourse. And so people can say, well, the economy was growing, or I am interested in, oil, or I'm interested in metals and nickel. But none of that stuff matters because there's a big disconnect between the oil or the nickel or whatever you're investing in and the profits, because the guys who are running these companies have every incentive to steal from you, and there's no disincentive against stealing from you, and there's nothing you can do if you catch them. And so, I mean, and by the way, this is not just a Russia thing. I mean, there are people investing in China. Probably a lot of people who are listening in right now. And China is the same thing. If they decide to take everything away from you, you have absolutely there's nothing you can do. And so, how do you handicap that? How do you factor that into your valuations? And I know, having been in this world for many years, that most people, when they can't figure out how to do that, they just don't, and they just look at the other stuff. And they, I would imagine that there are people making the wrong valuation decisions because they're not factoring in how much of a discount all this type of legal risk justifies.
Right, and so that's, let's call it, more the fiduciary violations, then obviously there's the human rights violations. And as you noted, it's more than just Russia, China as well. And while maybe most people in the U.S. or maybe most companies are not aware of the extent of the corruption that you've exposed in Russia, presumably the U.S. government knows, and Europe is aware of that, but has turned a blind eye for a number of years. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on why is it there hasn't been sort of uh, more of a sovereign sort of response to Russia pre Ukraine? Is it just one of those things where bureaucrats in the West got used to commodities coming from Putin and let him be? Why is it that we're in a place now where everyone's trying to play catch up?
Well, because Putin was always this really unpredictable character that nobody really wanted to mess with. He was like some kind of crazy guy in the neighborhood who's like, running down the street with a knife, and instead of like confronting him, everyone just wanted to like duck away from him and like, shut their shops and lock the door. And so you ended up having this sort of combination of things. One is nobody wanted to like have to confront him and deal with him because he was so volatile. And then two, he had done a really good job of softening the ground everywhere by literally paying people off. Like in Germany, there was Gerhard Schroeder, the former chancellor, who, like, the minute he stopped being chancellor, he became like a board member of the Gazprom's pipeline company, and then went on to like make, I don't, not even huge money by Wall Street standards, but like big money by German chancellor standards, a few $1 million or whatever, getting paid by Putin, and then going back in Germany and softening the ground in his Social Democratic Party, and then you had all these arrogant guys in America. You had basically every American president thought, "Wow, I'm so cool. I became the president of the United States of America. I'm the best guy there is. Whoever my predecessor was doesn't know how to deal with this guy, but because I'm so great and so wonderful, I'm going to go and like charm him into doing stuff." And Putin just laughed at every American president because they would, show up thinking, have something like a reset or, some type of uh, attempt to calm things down with Putin, and then he'd end up with a good 3 to 5 years of like no reaction to his bad actions. Um, and then, of course, you just had, like, in the UK, where I live, there's just so much Russian money sloshing around here, and literally members of the House of Lords, which is the upper chamber of Parliament, were on the payroll, physically on the payroll, getting money, not even ashamed of themselves, softening the ground. And so you put all this stuff together, and every time Putin did something terrible, he invaded Georgia, nothing happened. He took Crimea, nothing happened. He carpet bombed Syria, nothing happened. And and so Putin is sitting there thinking, the West is weak. I can do whatever I want. Nothing's going to happen.
And on that point about being on the payroll, I mean, presumably there have got to be all kinds of anti-money laundering type of laws in place. It sounds to me like it's more a situation where it's either being hidden or just the laws are not being enforced.
Yeah, well, it's the second. The laws are not being enforced. So I live in London. I've been screaming bloody murder about Putin for the last decade and a half. I have the opportunity to like physically visit politicians, law enforcement officials, government regulators on a regular basis with very well laid out evidence, PowerPoint presentations, criminal complaints, and they've never once acted on anything I've ever presented. And I should point out that what I've presented here is the same kind of evidence I presented in other countries where they have acted. So many other countries have frozen assets and so on and so forth. And in this country, they never ever opened a criminal case connected to the money laundering of from the Sergei Magnitsky murder. And I was feeling all very hard done by until I realized that they've never opened a criminal case into money laundering connected to Russia against anybody in 22 years. Not a single prosecution. Now that's changed like 2 weeks ago. They finally arrested one of the oligarchs for money laundering, but 22 years, not a single case, and that creates a pretty permissive environment. Well, I think that Russia has pretty much shut itself off from the capital markets for the next 3 decades. I mean, nobody is going to go anywhere near Russia for such a long time. I mean, Putin has completely ruined any chance of Western foreign direct investment. And China and places like that, they've never been big foreign direct investors um, in places like Russia, and I don't think that they want to risk their, why would a Chinese company take greater risk than a Western company? They're not guaranteed any specific property rights. So I don't think that I don't think Russia is gonna. I think that he's really kind of blown it as far as uh, any kind of foreign investment. I think it really on the other countries. It really depends on how this how this conflict plays itself out. If Ukraine wins this war, and I think there's not an insignificant chance that it does. I mean, if you take the current trajectory, Ukraine has expelled Russia out of 54% of the territory that was taken over. I think it's entirely possible, probable even, that Ukraine wins this war. If they win the war, um, then I think Ukraine will be a place. Ukraine has gone from a place that nobody really thought about or cared about to, a sort of underdog hero of this whole thing, and also, a country that wasn't much less corrupt than Russia. They've had to become dramatically less corrupt in order to attract all this military and financial aid. And so Ukraine has an opportunity to become a real sort of European type of country in the future with real investment. And I would imagine if the war were to ever end, um, I can imagine there'll be a Marshall Plan or something like that for Ukraine. And I can imagine it will become a place where people may very well want to do business. You mentioned Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is in a certain way sitting on the other side of Russia, and totally vulnerable to the same type of nastiness that Russia has imposed on Ukraine. And so I'd be a little scared of getting involved in Kazakhstan because unlike Ukraine, which is bordering on a number of Western countries, Kazakhstan isn't. And so it's not like they're going to get the Western defense, the way the Ukrainians got if the Russians were ever to turn their military sights on Kazakhstan. Well, I don't know so much about the zero net carbon issues for Ukraine. It's not something I've looked at. But one thing I would say is that Vladimir Putin has done more for the green energy movement by invading Ukraine than anybody could have ever done in any other circumstance. By invading Ukraine, by pushing up the price of oil and gas, by restricting the supply of gas to Europe, it's forced everybody to say, whoa, if we can't get that Russian gas, what are we going to use? And as far as I'm aware, it takes like 14 months now to get a solar panel in Germany, and they're doing everything they can possibly do to find other sources of energy. And so, as I said, I don't know much about Ukraine, but what I can say is that this has definitely accelerated the push towards zero carbon in Europe.
Bill, I want to go back to you speak at that point if Ukraine, in quotes, wins. And I feel like people throw that term wins around a lot without exactly defining it. I mean, you can argue that George Bush thought that he won the Iraq War when he said mission accomplished. And then, many, many years later, that was maybe the quote unquote win. So what is winning for Putin and for Ukraine?
Well, so let's start with Ukraine. It's pretty straightforward. If the Ukrainians were to expel Russian forces from their territory, that's winning. How do you define what territories you want to have them expelled from? I would argue that there's the pre-February 24th territories, which is sort of a solid win, and then there is the pre-2014 territories, which is mainly Crimea, which is a spectacular win. And for what it's worth, I believe if Ukraine were to succeed in the spectacular win of getting rid of Russia out of Crimea, I think that would lead to Putin's downfall. I don't think that you can be a hardman dictator and lose a war in such a humiliating way, particularly since that was such a big sort of trophy for him. And the Russians, they can tolerate human rights abuse, they can tolerate economic hardship, but what they can't tolerate is having their strong man be a loser. And so that's kind of that would be the good win in my opinion. Well, I mean, I think it's more common sense. So first of all, I in my career, my main career and my main success came from investing in emerging markets. And since that career ended and I've been doing other things, I still invest because I have my own capital, and I don't invest a penny of my capital now in emerging markets. It's all in developed markets. And it's pretty straightforward, which is that I want to invest in markets in countries where if somebody does something unfair and unjust financially, I have a recourse to the courts and I have property rights, and I can challenge them in a non-political way to resolve my differences. I mean, in any business situation, the reason why you have contracts and the reason why you have laws is because there's an incentive for people. People want your capital. You put your capital in, and all of a sudden it starts generating returns, and there's an incentive for them not to give you those returns. That's just like human nature. People once you've taken your risk, they don't want to give you your returns. That's just like how any basic person would think. And the reason why you have a rule of law and you have property rights is so that people can't do that. And so, from my perspective, what does that mean? I want to go to countries where the rule of law is well established, where there's no people just bribing judges to make things happen. And so what does that mean? It means going to European countries, of course, the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, places where there's a totally functioning court system. And not every place is 100% perfect, but I don't want to go to in Brazil, all great things could be happening there, but I know for sure that a local person can go and bribe a judge, and I don't want to be on the other side of that situation if I'm getting ripped off. Well, I mean, all sorts of people do things for different reasons. So, there's many fund managers or fund management companies that say, we're offering our China fund because we have demand from our clients to invest in China. And so there's, they're sort of, saying it's demand driven. And so it's not their fault if China were to expropriate it all. And I would imagine there are people who said the same thing about their Russian funds. I can't imagine that there are many fund management groups that are investing in China or other dodgy places because they felt like they had to be there from the government of that country. I think it's more either they're just doing it, they're just allocating capital to these countries because they have clients that want to do that, or they think it's just profitable to do, and they want to have a vehicle to send their way. I think it's but I think that people don't really the regular person doesn't really understand how dodgy a lot of these places are. You go to Indonesia, you go to Brazil, you go to Egypt, you're just not going to get treated fairly, and it doesn't matter what the economic growth is in these places. So the big end game question is really the crucial one, which is what is Putin trying to achieve? And in my opinion, and this is different than other people's opinions, I think the main reason he's at war in Ukraine is not because of NATO or NATO enlargement or some vision of a grand Russian empire. I think the simple reason why he's in Ukraine is that he and about 1,000 people around him have stolen so much money since he became president. And I'm talking about like $1 trillion of state money has been stolen by these 1,000 people, that he's just terrified that one day there'll be people with pitchforks on Red Square, because you just can't steal that kind of money from the people and have them put up with it, particularly after 22 years. And so what do you do if you're a dictator and you're worried about your people rising up? You create a foreign enemy. You start a war, straight out of Machiavelli, Machiavelli 101. You start a war, and that's what I believe the war in Ukraine is about. And so if you believe my logic is correct, then his end game is just being at war, which is really an important conclusion, because first of all, it means that there's no real negotiated settlement. You can't there's nothing he can really get from a negotiation that would satisfy him. And for what it's worth, he never negotiates anyway. And so that means there's only two outcomes to this thing. If you can't negotiate a settlement, then either Russia wins or Ukraine wins. And if Russia wins, coming back to Michael's original question, how do you define winning? If Russia wins, and let's say Ukraine, surrenders to Russia, that's not the end of the problem. Putin still needs to be at war. And so what does he do next? Well, he then shows up at the Estonian border. And when he's at the Estonian border, then we have just the worst possible choice anyone could ever have, which is either we, the United States, UK, EU, go to war with Russia, which is horrific and unimaginable, or equally horrific and unimaginable is that we don't go to war with Russia because we would then be abandoning our NATO ally, Estonia. And if we're abandoning a NATO ally, then it means NATO no longer works. Then Putin can just go pick off all sorts of people all over the place, and we're back into 1939 Europe. And so it leads us back to the other option, which is Ukraine winning the war. And Ukraine has been winning the war, but the level of support from the United States and other countries has been strong, but it hasn't been strong enough. The United States has very thoughtfully and purposefully given the Ukrainians enough weaponry not to lose the war, but they very specifically haven't given the Ukrainians enough weaponry to win the war. And we have to do that, because if we don't do that, then this thing just drags on. And one of my big fears, if it drags on, is that eventually time is on Putin's side. He doesn't have a democracy. He doesn't care what his people think. But in all of our democracies, the United States and Europe and UK, people are tired of paying high gas prices and inflation and all this kind of stuff. And enough time passes, and you'll end up with some kind of populist leader that says, I'm going to come in there and stop all this stuff. And if the Ukrainians don't get the Western military and financial support, they will lose. And so it's a tenuous, dicey situation. Could go either way, and depends how long it lasts.
And I would add, I mean, I've seen more and more of that sentiment. People saying, we're dealing with high inflation and we're borrowing money to give it to Ukraine. You never really had that at the start of the year, right? But you do have, I think, at the fringe, more and more people expressing that whether you think it's right or wrong, it is starting to get into the conversation.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, look, and you have Orban of Hungary vetoed $18 billion financial aid package from the EU, which requires unanimity at the EU last week. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, not another penny for Ukraine. And you have, I would argue, Russian paid for demonstrations in Germany, no more sanctions. All sorts of stuff is kind of, filtering in there. And the longer it goes on for, the more that happens. And by the way, it's not an unreasonable thing just to say, how much more money do we have to spend? And I actually do have a solution to this whole conundrum, which is very simple, which is that at the start of the war, the Western governments froze $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves. And so there's the easy place to get the money to pay for Ukraine so we don't have to dig into our pockets, and that's just let Russia pay for it. And that's one of the things I'm advocating for in different parliaments and governments around the world right now is we don't have to send our money to Ukraine. Let the Russians pay for it. They broke it. They've got to fix it. Well, it kind of feels to me like we have pushed our capacity as far as it can be pushed at the moment, which is not good enough, by the way. I don't agree with this. I think that there's only 40 oligarchs sanctioned. There's 118 of them on the Forbes list. As you mentioned, there's a bunch of banks that are still not sanctioned, and Russia still sells $1 billion a day, or it did, I should say, as of 2 weeks ago, $1 billion a day of oil and gas to the West, and that's about the amount of money they spend every day killing Ukrainians. And so it's the West doesn't really have. It kind of feels like to me like the West has sort of done as much as as we would expect it to under the current circumstances, which is not good. But here's what I've learned in my own fights with Putin over the last 13 years is that whenever we think we've sort of run out of momentum in my own campaign, for example, Putin would just do something so outrageous that everybody who was starting to drift away from me would all of a sudden come right back to me, and that's where we ended up getting Magnitsky acts in 35 countries around the world. And I think the same is true with this war. Every time we think that people are growing tired of it, they're getting upset about high prices and freezing and all this kind of stuff. Putin does something worse and worse, and everyone watches it on their television screens, and then he kind of gives us a shot in the arm to like behave ourselves and draw closer and shut down more loopholes. And like for example, I think it was about 10 days ago, the European Union finally, and the West actually, not just the European Union, the G7, put this price cap on Russian oil. The price cap was at $60, and it said that basically any boat that moved Russian oil that was being sold for more than $60 couldn't be insured, and all sorts of other sanctions, et cetera. And so that's a way of cutting off some of Russia's financial flows for this type of thing. There's actually one other thing I should just throw into the conversation here, which and since this is a conversation with people involved in the markets, you'll probably be more appreciative of this than most. And that is that there's one thing that will happen, in my opinion, regardless of what any government does to try to counter Putin, and that's simply that as interest rates continue to rise in order to fight inflation, we're already starting to see economic slowdown, and I suspect we'll see even further economic slowdown. And what happens when you have a recession? Well, one of the things that happens is the price of oil goes down. And so, oil is sort of bobbing around sort of low 70s, but I can imagine a scenario where oil is, a lot lower than it is right now. And if that happens, that is Putin's lifeline. He has nothing else really. He can't borrow money from anywhere. His central bank reserves are frozen. His cost of extraction is pretty high. And he's got a bunch of other stuff in addition to the war that he's got to pay for. And so Putin really would be on the ropes if oil prices were to drop to, say, $45. And I think it's entirely plausible and possible, maybe even probable, if the results of the recession that I think we're probably going into may very well lead to that, and that could be the single biggest determinant of how this war ends up playing itself out. And for what it's worth, that was the determinant of what led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. Oil prices were between $10 and $20, and they just couldn't afford to do it anymore. Well, so America starts invading Canada and then raping Canadian women and castrating Canadian soldiers and taking Canadian babies and sending them off to California and destroying Canadian energy infrastructure, so they froze up there in Canada, and to make sure all the wheat that Canada exports to Africa and Latin America gets curtailed at the ports. I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Well, I mean, if that was the real concern of Putin's, which it isn't, then why is he not launching a war on Finland and Sweden right now? I think it's just a total red herring, this whole NATO thing. That's his argument. That's how he presents it to the world. He doesn't care about NATO. He just wants to he needs some argument in order to be at war. But I mean, let's face it. If this was such a critical thing, then why hasn't he? Why is Sweden sitting pretty right now? Sweden has just joined NATO.
I'm curious, Bill. I mean, I'm sure you've still got a lot of connections and relationships in Russia. What's the mood on the ground with citizens, with those that we're probably not hearing too much about in the Western media side of things?
The mood is very, very, very grim. People are very unhappy with what's happening on the ground. Their livelihoods, their safety has all been compromised because of this whole thing. But there's one thing that's really crucial for everyone to understand, is that Russia is like the most horrifying, unfair country in the world. Nobody believes in Russia that they have any impact over their surroundings. And so, just to give you a sort of like a real life example, if you were to visit somebody in Moscow and they're wealthy, you could go to their apartment and it would be the most beautiful apartment with like unbelievable wood or marble floors and arts and amazing decoration and just great stuff. And then the minute you walk out into the vestibule of their apartment building, it smells like urine. And because everybody is just so individualistic in Russia, and there's no sense of common concern that nobody is interested in, even in their own apartment buildings, like cooperating with their neighbors to keep like the stairwells clean. And this permeates every aspect of society. So everybody is just like every man for himself. Instead of when this war started, most people didn't care, and then all of a sudden they start drafting uh, men between the ages of 18 and 60, and something like 700,000 men flee the country. Um, if those 700,000 men had like marched on Red Square, that would be the end of this war. But instead, they fled the country because they're only looking out for their own narrow personal interests, and so everyone's like really unhappy there. It's just like, how can you be happy when you can no longer use your MasterCard, you can no longer watch Netflix, you can no longer buy a Western car, you can no longer have an Apple phone. You're unemployment, just all sorts of nastiness happening there. Um, and there's nothing you can do or say about it. And if you want, and by the way, good chance that you're going to get, rounded up in a press gang and sent off to be cannon fodder on the front. Nobody wants to be involved in that. I mean, just to give you an example, a friend of mine, an American journalist friend of mine, was in Moscow recently, and he told me that the restaurants that we used to go to, there are only women there, no men. The men can't show their faces because they're afraid they'll be drafted. What kind of country is that? Well, I mean, I have some. My feeling is that it's very very difficult um, for an authoritarian regime to have a sustainable long term model that works. For one simple reason that in democracies you have all these self correcting mechanisms. If somebody does something stupid, who's running the country, you vote them out, and then you bring in somebody with a better idea. And in China, you know, there has been a period of time when they could sort of use their authoritarian model and say, look, all this fractiousness of a democracy is so inconvenient, and we can really grow our economy. And they did that for a while, and the deal they had with the Chinese people was, just enjoy the fruits of a good economy and don't make a fuss about any of this politics, and that kind of worked. But this new guy, Xi Jinping, is he's kind of deviating from that whole thing, and he's saying, let's lock our country down so that nobody can move, for 6 months or 3 months or whatever, and zero COVID, or we're going to shut down this tech company or that tech company because they're becoming too powerful, and it all of a sudden becomes their objective is no longer economic, and they start doing arbitrary things, and as this type of stuff goes on, there's no check, there's no balance, there's nobody to say, you know what, that's stupid, you messed up, time for you to go, we want somebody else. And that kind of scenario, I think, is an extremely bad one for the future of China. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm 58 years old. When I was in business school, I was 25, and at the time I was in business school, Japan was like the Japanese stock market was trading at like 60 times PE. Everything about Japan was the best thing in the world, and everyone said, "Look at Japan. Japan is just the best, best, best." We all studied Japanese companies, and then like a couple of years later, the Japanese stock market crashed, the real estate market crashed, and they've been in a state of sort of economic sort of desperation ever since. And nobody is saying, "Wow, let's like model ourselves on Japan." I can't imagine that we're not going to see something very similar with China, where their best time is behind them, not in front of them. Well, so Putin, he held off on invading Ukraine. Uh, the timing was totally dependent on China. Xi Jinping was doing his Olympics, and Putin, wanted to be deferential, and he said, "Okay, I'm not going to do this invasion until after your Olympics." And when he went to China to visit him at the Olympics, and he told him that this is going to be great. When you're done with your Olympics, we're going to invade Ukraine, and it's going to be a total and absolute humiliation for the United States and all these democracies that are giving us such a hard time. And Xi was saying, "Great, that's excellent. Let's humiliate them, and it'll be a 3-day war, and it's going to be just great for all of these dictatorships." And so Putin does his invasion and totally miscalculates everything. And it's not a 3-day war, but it's now a 10-month war. And what happens during the war? Oil prices go up, and gas prices go up, and food prices go up, and China is a country which is importing all this stuff. And even if they get a discount on whatever they buy from Russia, that discount is a discount off of a higher price. And so this isn't helping him at all. And I remember when everybody said, well, once MasterCard and Visa are kicked out, Alipay will take over. Well, Alipay doesn't want to be on the U.S. sanctions list. When Apple phones stopped being sold there, then they thought the Chinese would start selling their phones. But look at what happened to Huawei. No one else wants to be in that position. And so it's not like the Chinese. I think the trade has gone down with China, other than oil. And so China, this is not working out at all well for China. And then India is another story. India is a democracy. If and the Indians aren't they're not looking at Russia and saying, wow, we like these savages, raping Ukrainian women. They don't like that at all. And so, India can try to play the neutral card only up to a point. And so you've got, Russia really doesn't have any big friends in the world. And as they started running out of ammunition, where are they getting their ammunition from? North Korea and Iran. Nobody else wants to supply them with any military aid because nobody else wants to be on the U.S. shit list. And that is so Russia really is not getting what they want from China. The only thing they're getting from China right now is a little bit of diplomatic support at the United Nations, but beyond that, it's really pretty mild. Well, I mean, I think at this point, everybody is starting to spend more money on their military budgets. I mean, it's all of a sudden. I think in the past, this was Trump's big thing, was like, why are we paying 3% of GDP and no one else is, other than like one or two countries? And the reason is everybody was like, it's kind of like, why spend money if everything is going so calmly? And I can remember when the Cold War ended, there was this big concept. It's called the peace dividend, which is you don't have to spend any money on military, which doesn't have the same multiplier as spending money on like something else. And so we've all been this great beneficiary of this peace dividend, and nobody really wanted to cut that off. But now all of a sudden, people are saying, oh my God, if you're sitting in Poland or Germany and you're thinking, God, we could end up becoming part of Russia if we don't defend ourselves. And so we got to spend a lot more money on our military, on our NATO commitments and on our military budget. I mean, I heard a really interesting statistic. So the UK, where I live, it's a country of about 70 million people, and I think there's somewhere between 50 and 100,000 soldiers in total. And then you've got Finland, and I can't remember the population. I think it's like 7 million. But because they're on Russia's border and they've had such trouble over a long period of time, there's 250,000 people that could be called up, reservists called up in a military confrontation. And so, I think everybody's kind of waking up now to saying, life is not so joyous and simple as it was before when you have countries like Russia, invading their neighbors and threatening everybody. Well, it's a really good question, and one which needs to be addressed. And so first of all, I believe that Putin has sort of redefined criminality, state criminality, in a way that we haven't seen since the Second World War. He's really, I mean, what he's done is truly monumentally changed the goalposts in terms of crime. And so he's now sort of standing behind sovereign immunity. The thing that protects the central bank reserves is a concept of sovereign immunity, which means states' money can't be touched. Like you can't touch an embassy and you can't touch country's central bank reserves. But I would argue that this is very similar to the way in which the mafia used to behave in the United States. That they would run circles around law enforcement, using all sorts of tactics and tricks and so on. And eventually, they had to adjust the laws in the West, in the United States, to deal with mafia, and they came up with something called the RICO law. I'm sure you've all heard of it: racketeering and influence corrupt organizations. And the RICO law allowed this it basically got rid of these things, all these different loopholes that the mafia was hiding behind, and they were able to execute many mafia prosecutions. And I would argue that international law needs to be adjusted now to basically adjust to how Putin is behaving, which doesn't mean you get rid of sovereign immunity in its entirety. You say that if a country commits an act of aggression, and the act of aggression is recognized by a certain proportion of countries or members of the United Nations, or however you want to define it, then in specific instances that you can then take money that they have and use it for reparations. And by the way, reparations are absolutely nothing new. After the Second World War, all private property and government property from Germany was expropriated to pay for the rebuilding of the country. And so it's not an unheard of concept. And by the way, the one unexpected consequence, which would be pretty satisfying, is that who's the other country that has so much central bank reserves in the West? That's China. And so perhaps China will be a little bit more reluctant to invade Taiwan or do some other horrible thing if they see that all their central bank reserves could be frozen. And some people say, well, then people aren't going to keep central bank reserves in the West. Well, that may be true if just the United States did this, but if the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, Japan, UK were to do this, and Switzerland, where else are countries going to keep their current account surplus and their reserves? And so I think that we have some leverage here, and we should use it, and certainly we should use it for Ukraine.
I think that's a good place to end the space, given that we're at the top of the hour here. Again, everybody, please make sure you follow Bill Browder on Twitter. Check out his books as well on Amazon. Bill, any kind of final thoughts or anything else that you think people should be focusing on before we wrap up?
I think it's good. We had a great conversation. I've got to run on to something else right this second, but I really appreciate all the questions and all the good thoughts, and thanks for organizing this, Michael.
Cheers, everybody. Thank you.